In terms of factory disasters where a structural building collapses and the deaths take place, this was probably one of the worst incidents of its kind, one of the top incidents of its kind. And it led to a serious rethinking in the industry. It led to a lot of pressure on global brands. It led to pressure on Bangladesh and its supervision system, as well as on people who actually run the factories, the local suppliers.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights in Business, also known as IHRB. I'm Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you will hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. April 24 marks the 10-year anniversary of the collapse of the Rana Plaza building in Bangladesh. The incident killed 1,134 people and injured thousands more working in clothing factories inside the building. A decade later, questions about Rana Plaza remain. You're about to listen to a conversation with Sanchita Banerjee Saxena from the Sabir and Malini Chowdhury Center for Bangladesh Studies and IHRB's Salil Tripathi. Together, they discuss renewed action that's needed to stop a similar tragedy from happening again.
Let's talk about what happened at Rana Plaza. Tell us what happened.
Well, as you said, Salil, it was it is considered to be one of the worst or the worst industrial disaster to ever take place. And I think it was such a tragedy and entirely preventable, which just has made it worse. I think, when we think about what brands and retailers and consumers and all of us learned, I mean, on one level, I think it was just a really jarring wake-up call. It's not fun to have your tags being pulled out of the rubble of a collapsed building where more than 1,000 workers have died. And at that time, I remember it very distinctly. I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday because the horrific images went viral on social media. And I think it was really the first time when there was a direct link that was made between global brands who are producing clothing in Bangladesh and workers who are victims, in this terrible tragedy. And I think it was at that time also a real wake-up call to say that we can't ignore what's happening in these complex global supply chains. For decades, global retailers, consumers, even governments just turned a blind eye to what was happening. And it was just, it was happening over there, it was far away, and it was hoping that these issues were not, if they weren't addressed directly, that maybe the reality, we wouldn't have to face the reality. So as a response, North American and European manufacturers came together and, they formed two different initiatives to address, factory safety. The two mechanisms, as most people would know, known as the Accord and the Alliance, they were fundamentally different, and European brands primarily joined the Accord. And these initiatives, I mean, we detail it in our piece. They really concentrated on technocratic approaches to address the lack of worker safety, and they focused really on fire, electrical, structural improvements to a portion of the country's registered factories. And while this was very necessary, this was not really sufficient to address many of these longstanding concerns.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think even from the perspective of business and human rights, it became a fairly pivotal issue because the whole notion of a multinational seeking a location where they invest away from scrutiny of the regulatory framework in which they are part of is partly driven by costs, partly driven by the need to have cheaper labor force, and partly driven by efficiencies, which of course the modern transport provides. And I think therefore from a business and human rights perspective, it became a very pivotal moment that companies had to take very seriously the responsibilities that go beyond. Now, turning again on that question for you, Sanchita, is that what did businesses and other actors learn from this disaster, and what did they do? And I mean, you spoke about Accord and Alliance, but in terms of responses, how did the companies react?
So, companies, I mean, as I said, in the beginning, it was certainly not, it's not a desirable thing to be associated with such a horrific tragedy. And so I think companies, for the first time did react. I think there was something about, many coalitions sort of taking place in the industry, which was really important. But I think, if we try to look at, these 10 years and what has happened, I think, again, despite the improvements to the, sort of the structural safety that we were talking about, just due to the various, power dynamics in the industry and the difficult nature of the work itself, when we look at how garment workers have fared, and particularly women, in the last 10 years, I mean, we really see that garment workers, I mean, they're facing a number of difficulties. They continue to face sexual harm, suffering, gendered discipline practices, severe health consequences, barriers to freedom of association, low wages, long working hours. And so what has happened is, I think, this limited sort of technocratic approach of the court, of the lines to some extent, it sort of served to reassure global retailers that, you've addressed the problem and you can sort of continue on as usual, as business as usual. And buildings now are a lot safer, but there are major concerns, which now what we realize, I think now there's a lot more awareness that they're really linked to a large part around the sourcing strategy of this industry itself, of the way the business model has worked for decades in the fashion industry. And this particular business model, the one, the very much of a just-in-time type of model, really does contribute to declines in mental and physical health of workers, and it leaves them insecure and without any social protections. As you mentioned, one of the reports that we collaborated on during the pandemic, we found that even during, 1 month when global brands reneged on, what they owed to Bangladeshi factories, even in that 1 month of when workers did not receive wages, we saw that how their conditions were made even more precarious. I mean, we detailed it in that report. Millions of workers, they suffered, they found themselves out of work, they were furloughed without pay, their savings depleted. I mean, the report found, for example, that 65% of workers said that they didn't have any savings, or they used their savings to to buy food. And of course, there was no safety net to fall back on. So I think in the last 10 years, we've, again, just coming back to, what has been addressed, a lot of the factories, in the basic level, I think we can't consider them sweatshops in the sense what we used to think about it maybe, 30 years ago. That has changed. But the lot of the conditions of workers, who toil in this industry has unfortunately not improved. And also, we have to remember, I mean, the focus of our improvement, or where we see the improvements need to be made, is really always been at the factory site, because that's where we see the labor violations happening. But again, researchers like Mark Anner and others have really documented sort of this, what Mark Anner has called the triple squeeze of just-in-time production. And so it's like a combination of lowering costs and faster and quicker production, and then the prevalence of the fast fashion industry. So all of that has really led to just continued poor working conditions that unfortunately have almost gotten worse in the last 10 years.
Not to be very cynical about it, but what you say almost sound like we're putting band-aid on fracture. And I don't want to use the word cancer because I hope it is not that fatal, but it is putting band-aid on fracture. I think we should bear in mind. And I think another point worth noting, which is something we found in the paper that we are releasing today, the paper on 10 years of Rana Plaza that you and I have collaborated on, one of the things that we have found is that this is not a problem unique to Bangladesh. I mean, this is not something that only happens in Bangladesh. I mean, one of the things that one of my colleagues reminded me of is that India has had factory fires, and statistics that I was looking at some days ago showed me that in 5 years ending in 2021, 6,500 workers had died in factory fires in India. So it's not a small number we are talking about. Pakistan has had similar problems. China has a similar problem. So it's not unique to Bangladesh. But within Bangladesh, actually, as you know so well, the ready-made garment sector is one of the better administered sectors. It has good controls, it has international scrutiny, but that's only the creamy layer. There's a huge layer beneath of other factories which produce for non-Western countries or which produce for the local markets where the conditions are worse. And as we discovered to our horror when we were working on this paper, is that there are other sectors such as brick making and ship breaking and transport and fisheries and agriculture where the conditions are far worse. They are also important for Bangladesh's economy. So there is a specific problem that definitely exists within the country. There is also a problem that is replicable elsewhere, and therefore Bangladesh is not unique. So it is not time to declare victory because of one accord and one alliance. That's what we felt. But tell me, what would be three or four things that you think that need to be done to make lives better?
Well, I think, I am encouraged in the last 10 years. I mean, as despite where I think there have been limited improvements. On the other hand, I think in the last 10 years, and I think Rana Plaza really did trigger some of these positive changes, which I think are really, really needed and important. So, if you're thinking about if I think about, what has kind of happened and where we might go, thinking about what has already happened, I mean, it's very encouraging to see the enactment of human rights due diligence legislation coming out of primarily the European Union, and these regulations were basically require companies to understand, what is happening in their supply chains, understand the human rights risks, and to do something about them. And otherwise, they will be legally liable. And so that's a real shift. I mean, it's the same sort of 10 years ago, or a little more than 10 years ago, the UN guiding principles were established, and, as voluntary principles, but setting up guidelines and making companies accountable. And now we're seeing in the area of hard legislation, really trying to, the transparency is going to be essential. Companies have to take seriously. They cannot pretend or say, I didn't know, which I think 10 years ago, if you remember, Salil, I don't know if I mean, I'm sure you recall that the disaster and the sort of the aftermath. But if you remember, a lot of the reaction was by companies who were producing from that building. I didn't realize, or I didn't know.
Funny thing is that, just a year before was a Tarzine fire factory,
Yeah, yeah,
fire. So it was not, it was, that was a wake up call. Ashulia had a crisis too earlier
yeah,
in
yeah.
Bangladesh. It's not a unique, it is a recurrent phenomenon. It's just the scale and the number of deaths that made people think that now we better get something.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. And unfortunately, I mean, it always takes something like a horrible, horrific, sort of spectacular disaster to bring, awareness and bring actual concrete, ways to address the problem. And that's unfortunate, but that is oftentimes how you see change happening in many cases, and it's these spectacular events that result in that, which also means that we should not forget kind of the day-to-day conditions of workers, which, the kind of violence that they are subject to. It doesn't make the news in the same way, but it's kind of a part of their daily lives. But I want to touch on maybe a couple more things. I think I'm encouraged to see the Accord and the Alliance, as we've discussed. I mean, they were limited, but this idea of that they were binding agreements, and I think again moving towards beyond voluntary measures, which we've realized from earlier on, for the last several decades, there's been sort of voluntary measures that we've asked companies to engage in. Those are very limited. But changing the focus and focusing more on binding agreements has, I think, been a important trend, sort of post Rana Plaza. One recent example is actually again, addressing a critical issue in the industry, which is gender based violence and harassment of female workers. And the Dindigul Agreement, it's a very historic agreement between factories.
Yeah, Dindigul is a part of Tamil Nadu in India. Yes.
Yes, exactly. And the agreement is actually between factories, women workers. It includes a Dalit workers' union and clothing and textile manufacturers based in South India and three global apparel brands all together to address this pervasive problem of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And so those that is very encouraging. And we hope that there will be other such types of agreements established and not just focused on structural issues, but other issues that are critical and just as important to workers' lives. Of course, as we spoke, the pandemic was something that was, a few years ago, just kind of appended everything that we know. And what it also did was it really sort of put a spotlight on a lot of the inequality and the power, imbalance in the sector. But as a result of the pandemic and what we saw in terms of the behavior of many corporate brands who just reneged on their financial obligations, what we saw is actually in 2021, the American Bar Association publishing a set of model contract clauses and to help companies and suppliers actually redesign their contracts to better protect human rights in the supply chain. And again, it's very innovative, very much needed, because as we know, these contracts are often very much skewed in favor of the global brands and kind of putting everything onto the supplier in terms of responsibility. But these are the first time that there are contract clauses that actually can just be integrated into existing contracts, but they try to uphold the UN guiding principles and the OECD due diligence guidance. So that's a huge shift. And if we see some of that taking place, I think that's very hopeful.
Yeah, and also that's a very practical way to deal with it. It's very easy to have aspirational statements, but when it's put down in contract, as you were talking about the binding part of it, it's very important. And also see there are some other thing that we, as we argue in our paper, looking ahead, there is still going to be a lot of work that needs to be done. And one is the need for greater collective action. And one of the things that I think is essential there is not just Bangladeshi civil society and trade unions and Bangladeshi suppliers and Bangladeshi government or host government. I mean, I'm talking about any host government. It's not, let's depersonalize it from Bangladesh, and the global brands and the global civil society and the global. I mean, if the European Union were to come up with a framework and require companies within the union to work in a particular way, and then if the unions in Europe and elsewhere fall in line, that becomes a very powerful force. So I think collective action is going to be very important in addressing crises of this nature. And the other is, of course, the increased accountability of the state actor. And by that, I don't only mean home government, host governments, but also home governments. Because, of course, the factories are sited in developing world. So there is a responsibility. But I think home government, where the companies are based, have some responsibility in regulating the conduct of their companies. And finally, I think what we've learned in this working on this briefing note is that we need safer and secure factories which are critical for workers' well-being. So it's not simply the safety of the building, as you put it so well. It's not just the concrete and the infrastructure, but the mental well-being and the social safety, the security that the person should feel. I mean, you put it so well earlier in this conversation that people did not have savings. People are literally living month by month. So if they lose even 1 month's salary, many people, the kind of people who listen to this podcast, the kind of people who are part of the Business and Human Rights Network, they can probably afford to have 1 or 2 months without wages. Maybe. I'm not saying that they can, but it's possible to that. But not for these workers. And we have to keep it in mind because as we found out in the report we did together the last time about COVID, they are the weakest link. And if it's the weakest link, they're the first to break. And that's something we simply cannot afford to do.
Now, let's hear from Nazma Akter, a former garment factory worker and director of the AWAJ Foundation.
Thank you, Nazma, for joining us.
Thank you, Salil. Is happy to part of this always with you.
Thank you so much. My first question is this, that 10 years Is the glass half full or half empty?
Is glass half full or half empty? I think it's not only half, it's lower than half is empty.
Is it?
Yes.
Why is it so bad?
Because the 10 years after Rana Plaza collapse, worker didn't get any justice.
Uh huh.
Most of the garments owner the owner, they are got the bail and now they move to Europe, America, somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no legal penalty or any justice for the workers, and also our workers are not getting decent wages, and still our workers are getting below poverty wages,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't have the living wages, and we
Is
don't
there a
have.
safety net? Because one of the things that when Sanchita, who has been speaking with us and working with us on this project, when we did the research, we found that when pandemic struck, the workers were really badly off and there was no safety net.
Still is same because we don't have any social protection system and we don't have that kind of support. And pandemic time, our workers lost their job because of the holding, suspension, and cancellation the order and asking for discount. And that time also our worker pay the discount their salary. That's the because it's a pandemic start and suddenly it's happened, and you can see in your eyes and people are concentrated on this, but still now we have less order, we don't have much production at this moment. Therefore every day, every moment, our workers are losing their job. And even when the workers are organizing union or raise their voice, freedom of expression, freedom of association, most of the time they're blacklisted, they lost their job, they have criminal uh, penalty, and nobody is listening them when they want to raise their voice, and they have no job security, and they always in the unsafe uh, working condition. Because I'm not talking about the safety, I'm talking about the working condition. And also, and the pandemic until now, the gender based violence and sexual harassment are increasing a lot, because I told you that our workers getting very low wages, and which is they need more money. And when people are treated as a cheap labor in the global supply chain, that means you have no respect, you have no dignity. So that's why the most of the factory management are the men and labor force are the women. So
Absolutely.
yeah, therefore the sexual harassment, abuse, and physical, mental, all aspect is facing, because they don't care, because if they give little money, little advantage, then women can easy to get them and abuse. And if the women are not listening them, they lost their job, and so many issues we have. And also uh, in one of the big issue also, the digitalization and automation also declining the women's worker job, because our
Right.
women's are working lower grade job. So that's also no government, no company, no one is taking seriously and take the action. And the rest of the production in Asia, in Bangladesh, is a patriotic
Yeah.
and fundamental and religious things are increasing. So they thought always the man can do the digital job, man can doing the all smart things and the heavy things. So it's a misconcept also declining the things. And also we have another issues about the climate labor nexus, because the corporate, especially the Europe, America, who are doing business in our country and in Asia, they are only look after their country, their nature, their environment, but they are destroy our environment. It's not only garments industries, all the hazardous work are production are happening in Asia. and it's like garments, like there is a denim production, knitting production. So when they use a lot of chemical, and also when they wash, they're not properly recycling the water and materials what they do, and it goes to our water, it goes to our river, it goes to the land, and it affected our country. And now in Bangladesh 41 degrees Celsius, which is never ever happen
Yes,
in our
it's a
country.
very hot summer this year.
Yeah.
Yes.
And also when you walk in the road, and when wind come to your body, it seems like fire comes to you, and you burn your body. So this kind of issues is very things are going on. Also, if I'm talking about the occupational health and safety, also one of the key issues, because the workers, especially women's workers, the sitting and also long working 12 to 14 hours,
Yeah.
it's affected their back pain, neck pain, eyes, and our workers has not much food as low wages and malnutrition, people are hunger. So occupational health and safety, the diseases also need to be addressed. And as you know, we have success that industrial global union and uni global union is signing the accord, and it's with the brand, and the accord is also expanded in Pakistan accord, and a lot of brand are signing, over 200 brand are signing in Bangladesh accord, and now the Pakistan accord is signing 45 to 46 brand. But we request all brand has to be joined with the brand, both accord. But the American company, they need to be more forward, and they need to be more respect
So,
the
so
legal.
tell me two or three things that you think Western companies can do.
Yeah.
What are the two things that you would like them to do?
The first, the fair price and
Yeah.
fair wages
Yeah.
is one of the issues, and the workers has to be get the legal binding effort, like freedom of association and collective bargaining, where they can negotiation and increase their wages and benefit as well as the productivity. And also we need signing the accord, and especially the American brand are absent, they are not signing the accord.
Yes,
And
they prefer
also,
the alliance.
yeah,
Yes.
and also I know this the days are we are talking about the human rights due diligence, mandatory human rights due diligence, so which is also need to be done, and which is also the workers should be also part of this. So therefore, and also stop the gender-based violence and harassment at workplace.
Thank you so much. I know that this shows that 10 years you have safer factories, but the workers are still not safe, and the safety has less to do with physical safety but mental and emotional safety. So, thank you so much for pointing it out, and more power to your work.
Salil also spoke to Rizwana Hassan, a lawyer and environmentalist, about the issue of worker safety in the shipping industry.
Thank you so much, Rizwana, for joining us. My first question is straightforward: your reflections on Rana Plaza and its aftermath, and what are its implications for other industries?
The impact of Rana Plaza, unfortunately, has not been that much on other export-oriented sector, and it hardly had any impact in the business sector that are import-oriented. For example, shipbreaking situation is actually going worse there because there's no monitoring, and in this particular case, the buyers, the developed countries, are just playing the opposite role. In the garment industry, they're asking for compliance because they want their consumers to wear something that's safe, that does not come out of sweat labor. In the case of shipbreaking, it's just the other way around. They're just dumping their toxic vessels, and they don't really care about labor safety. In the other major industrial sector, which is responsible for air pollution in Bangladesh, and we have the worst air of the world, I must tell you, the government has taken policy decisions to phase out burnt bricks and to switch to other sustainable alternatives, but we don't see much progress there. And this year also, the brick kiln has been marked has ranked as the lead polluter, causing air pollution. In the other export oriented sector, for example, shrimp cultivation, while the local communities resist shrimp cultivation because the salinity is impacting, destroying their paddy field, their livestock, their fishery, The government is actually in favor of the industry, which means that the government is actually in favor of at most 100 shrimp exporters. And in the areas where shrimp cultivation is taking place, there is no water. There is hardly any sweetwater fishery. There is hardly any greenery. In some areas, the communities have fought back and they have reclaimed their agricultural land from the clutch of the shrimp exporters. But in other areas, they haven't fully managed to do so. The High Court has come down heavily against the shrimp exporters. But as I said, the administration and the politics is very much in favor of dollars. So it has become a case of penny wise, pound foolish for Bangladesh.
Right. Now, the interesting part of what you're saying is that some of the industries you mentioned are consumer facing, such as shrimp and garment, certainly, and to some extent leather, you could argue that as well. But when you talk about brick and shipbreaking, you're talking about industries that are not consumer facing. So the pressure that the consumer can exert becomes less. In that context, what role do you see international businesses to play? Do you want them to set standards? Do you want to have better monitoring? Do you want international compliance through regulation?
It has to be a combination of all that you said, plus community empowerment. There has to be an effective grievance redressal mechanism at the national level and also at the international level. Not all your industries are export based. For the import oriented ones, we have to be empowering the communities. The grievance mechanism system has to be responsive. So, whenever there is a complaint from the community, the Department of Environment won't go to the field. Sitting here in the head office, they'll be giving a certificate that the ETP was functional and there is no pollution. That doesn't work much. Take the example of tannery. That also is an export oriented sector. And their export actually has gone down substantially when it came under public radar that they were polluting. They have killed one river in Dhaka called Buriganga. So when they were taken to a different site, a total new industrial estate developed only for that tannery industry, and the taxpayers had to pay out of their pocket for acquiring land for the tanners, and they had to pay from their pockets for setting up the central effluent treatment plant for the tanners. They actually did not comply. They just could not comply. They just don't have the psyche to comply. This is where the difference comes between the garment owners and the tanners, and this is the reason why I say that the garment owners are smarter than the tanneries. The tanneries were in a denial mood, but it was all clear to the people and to their buyer also that the nearby river is again getting polluted, and it's a new river. So they have polluted one, they have gone to a new one now. So then the pressure from the buyers have started to come, but we don't see our regulatory agencies in a mood to regulate industry. They think for development, industry has to continue. They don't really value the ecosystem. So how much the tannery is earning for the country and how much the country is losing by just killing one of its river is an estimation that our government has never done. So at the national level, in addition to a grievance redressal mechanism, we need to have a very clear EIA regime where public consultation, public participation has to be made mandatory. When we ask for EIA documents from our Department of Environment, if the project is politically blessed or otherwise very sensitive, they deny the information to us saying that EIA is an intellectual property document. Can you believe this? That is the argument that they give. So we need to properly implement whatever law we have in hand. We need to empower the community. And at the same time, if it is an export oriented industry, the buyers have a role to play, not only in imposing more and more conditions, but also in sharing the cost with the entrepreneurs. This is not a very rich country. If you are taking advantage of our poverty and at the same time you want us to improve, you better participate in the process.
Thank you so much. It just shows that the work is not done and that you still have a lot on your plate. And so, more power to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Voices. To mark the anniversary, Salil and Sanchita have published a paper titled Rana Plaza 10 Years On, Lessons for Human Rights in Business, which you can download and read at ihrb.org. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast. That way you will never miss an episode.